How could I dare to lay claim to either sageliness or goodness? What can be said about me is no more than this: I work at it without growing tired, and encourage others without growing weary. This description of himself was made by Kongzi, commonly known as Confucius in the West, who was a philosopher and a politician in China from the period of 551 BCE to 479 BCE. In the last lecture, we introduced the classical Chinese philosophers, noted their interest and their common unifying motivation, as well as differentiated cosmology and philosophy, and contrasted the Chinese philosophy from Western philosophy. So in this lecture, I will briefly go over his background and discuss the basis of Confucius' philosophy. Before we go on to learn about Confucianism, it must be noted that, like many of his contemporaries, such as Jesus, Buddha, and Socrates, Confucius also did not leave any writings behind for his teachings. So the fact that what we learn about him and his teachings were recorded and passed on by his students for thousands of years must be kept in mind. Also, what is commonly known as Confucianism in the West is actually called Ruism in China, and this fact also must be kept in mind as well. When we are learning about Confucianism, in this lecture and the subsequent ones, I will be using the term Confucianism when generally speaking, unless I'm talking about specific Confucianist scholars, such as Shunzi or Mencius and their own philosophy. Unlike Western philosophers, whose goals were to find the truth through questioning the existing structures and models and thus developed their own theories, to Chinese philosophers, to philosophize is to find the best transmissions of Tao, which was introduced in the previous lecture. Some could also say that Confucius advocated revivalism, a movement to effect positive social change in the present by rediscovering the deep meaning of the old texts, practices, and values. For example, Plato believed that there was a world where things are a lot more perfect, and humans have an intellectual access to these forms, so he radically questions the beliefs, practices, and morality of his societies and the Greek culture. However, for Confucius, there are no other higher worlds where things could be a lot more perfect than our current human civilization. It is certainly possible to define one's own tradition and practices and achieve a more perfect society, but the objection is only possible by appealing to other values, beliefs, and practices within the same tradition, and has to be grounded on this earth, since the Tao is already perfect. Hence, this discrepancy is highlighted by Confucius, who describes what he does as, "I transmit but do not create. I believe in and love the ancients." This method sometimes results in people not properly understanding what Confucianism is, and some go so far as to try to claim that it, along with other Eastern philosophical thoughts, is more similar to mysticism and religions rather than philosophy because they do not use logical reasoning, unlike the Western philosophers. However, as Chet Hansen, chair professor of Chinese philosophy at the University of Hong Kong, pointed it out as statements that reflect more of the speaker's ignorance rather than displaying a truth statement about Confucianism or other ideas, since what primarily highlights the discrepancy between philosophy and religion is their methods employed in answering their questions, and philosophers self-identify their methods with the idea of employing logical reasonings, such as giving reasons or giving off arguments. If we follow this line of thought, we will discover that although there was no presence of formal theories or logic in the Chinese classical period, the Chinese philosophers did employ sound logical reasoning in their discussions between different schools, just like those from the ancient Greek schools of philosophy. They were thinking logically, and they were thinking clearly about the issues, so it is best to illustrate this point by discussing them in further lectures. For those of us who live in a modern society, we would certainly object to this mode of revolution by claiming the importance of self-reliance and thinking for ourselves, not to be defined by our traditions and beliefs from the past, and can be seen as evidence by the decline in religious influence, and may label his teachings as too archaic in the modern world. However, our disdained attitudes derived from the thinkers of the Enlightenment era, who vehemently viewed that thinking for ourselves and thinking through our traditions are diametrically opposed. Therefore, we must see for ourselves that changes in reality reflects a deeper and more consistent expression of the tradition. Furthermore, because of the warring era in which Confucius grew up in, a time of chaos and corruption, Confucianism rose and attempted to reconstruct social order and to restore wide-reaching peace, which some would claim that his methods champion a return to normalcy. To achieve peace, he devised intricate political and social theories that gave the rule to everyone in society to follow. The society they proposed is fundamentally founded on family units. Confucians explained society should be a magnified family, the members of which, though differing in their status and functions, all work in harmony for the common good. However, it is worth noting that Confucianism does not attempt to reconstruct and transform their society into a socialistic, communal world in which everyone is indeed related to one another as brothers or sisters. They emphasized natural family relations, in which each unit consists of a father and a mother and siblings, and they advocated to love with distinctions. In short, one must always love one's family first and foremost. To achieve this ideal society, Confucian social reform begins from the highest level in society. They argued that if the ruler could set a good example for everyone in the country, then people would naturally follow him, whose characters are exemplary. Like the citizens following the example of the ruler, the son will follow the example of his father, and the students will follow the example of his master. He endorsed this social hierarchy since he saw that we naturally emulate our parents from their behaviors, attitudes, and characters from the time that we're born to the time when we leave our parents' home. It must be noted that a lot of people mistake this idea of respecting your parents and following their conduct with blind obedience. They make it seem as though children have to become like religious fanatics to their parents. This is a misunderstanding stemming from misinterpretations of Westerners. One example of these types are the educators on YouTube, whom I shall not be naming, who talk about philosophy from other nations that are so different from their way of thinking that instead of researching on it deeply before they discuss an idea, they just read up on it a bit and speak superficially on the matter. In reality, Confucians recognize that parents are human beings who also make mistakes in their beliefs and their way of living. They may stray away from the Tao, so children do not have to blindly follow their parents. Since we have a filial piety, not only toward our parents, but also toward our spouses and children, it is possible for us to sometimes tend to other duties that could just be as important as their duties toward our parents. We just have to perform the duty upon a careful and conscientious calculations of how other obligations are affected, as the following was noted: to comfort the old, to trust my friends, and to cherish the young. This is illustrated by the example of Emperor Shun, the mythic sage king that Confucians encourage everyone to aspire to, who married a woman without telling his mother. Instead, what they recommend is the following: in serving your mother and father, admonish them gently. If they understand, and yet choose not to follow your advice, deepen your reverence without losing faith. And however exhausting this may be, avoid resentment. What this means is that we may disagree with our parents. We can criticize them on their ways and their commands. However, we just have to do so in a respectful manner without being impatient. It can be interpreted that he commends having patience toward our parents, since they were patient with us when we were young, and we made mistakes and do things when we did not know any better. In the Book of Great Learning, there are 3 basic principles that rulers should follow: manifest a clear character, show great concern for his people, and aim for the highest good. In it describes 8 steps that are needed to establish peace, starting from cultivating personal morality through the regulation of the family and establishing national order. As Confucius once noted, there is never a case when the root is in disorder and yet the branches are in order. At the same time, once the root is well planted, the branches will grow healthily, and well-conducted personal life naturally leads to a moral transformation of the world. Therefore, it is important to notice that, from the perspective of a Confucian, morality and law are inseparable. The Confucians were critical of nations waging wars for conquest, but they deemed war as morally praiseworthy when it is launched with the purpose of relieving the suffering of the citizens in neighboring countries. For an average person who is concerned with material subsistence to live a virtuous moral life, they must be free of anxiety and trepidation for their livelihood. They also knew that it is difficult to advocate moral cultivation for the people when the people are preoccupied with the underdevelopment of their crops and the impending death of their family members. It was not possible to address the people's moral or spiritual transformations unless their livelihood was first taken care of. Their primary concern is the livelihood of the general masses, with no regard to the boundaries of the nation-states at the time. Prioritizing the well-being of the citizens, opposed to that of the rulers, whose primary concerns during the period of the spring and autumn period were waging wars against another state. Confucius' sentiment is reflected in his reply when the Duke of Wei asked him for his advice on his armies, as he coldly responded, "I know something about the arrangement of ceremonial stands and dishes for ritual offerings, but I have never learned about the arrangement of battalions and divisions." Li, or its rough translation to the ritual proprietary, which included offerings and performances toward one's ancestors, are essential to society since, Confucians argue, the process has an ability to separate a civilized nation consisting of proper people from an unruly flock of beasts. It is also important to mention here that Confucius was an agnostic, so his recommendations on performing Li was not coming from the perspective of a religious figure, but rather from the view of a scholar whose duty is to connect research into the Chinese history and combine it with his teachings. He did not rely on the existence of an afterlife. For him, ancestral veneration is about continuing the relationship of respect and responsibility toward those who have gone before us. This is reflected in his self-description at the beginning of the video. In normal daily life, a person will observe particular codes of conduct of how one should address one's elders in the family or elders in the neighborhood, how one should interact with someone of the opposite sex, and how one should conduct oneself in various social contexts. Thus, when a person is within these social boundaries, one will constantly try to be proper in different social contexts and with different people. An ideal person is one who is acclimated with his social environment, that one no longer needs to control oneself, even when one is under pressure. Humans are social creatures, and we mimic the behaviors of those who are around us. So when we manifest respect in our conduct for various social contexts, as well as for other people, our behavior will influence those around us. Thus, in consequence, can teach others to cultivate the same respect. Furthermore, Confucius, like Plato to his counterpart in Greece, saw the importance of rites and music in our daily life. He saw that rites can transform the people externally, while music has a transforming power from the inside. Music is a natural expression of one's joy and can possess the function of regulating one's emotion and harmonizing one's sentiments. Music was also employed as an instrument of the social structure. People in distinct levels of social structure may be permitted to play certain instruments, and for these instruments, their components were also severely regulated to signify that the performer's place in society. For example, for an ancient Chinese instrument called bianzhong that consists of tiny bianzhongs, only the scholars and the officials were permitted to play an entire set of the instrument, while people from the lower classes were only permitted to play a part of an instrument. Therefore, the way Confucians aimed to transform the general masses and achieve social harmony was by means of two cultural enhancements: rites and music. Confucius may have also had the same observation that Machiavelli did when he described humans as men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see and few can feel. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few really know who you are. Therefore, Confucius made sure that, in order to harmonize a person's inner and outer self, he devised intricate sets of rituals that one must go through, and emphasized that rituals will be held in different contexts, so that what the whole person manifests outside is also what is inwardly cultivated. In other words, a person's true inner self will always be outwardly displayed, so that when everyone interacts with each other, they will know who everyone truly is and will inspire to improve themselves. To understand his moral philosophy, it is important to understand the whole picture and not just an analysis of his moral concepts, so they will be explored in later episodes in which I will be discussing the topic in further detail. Confucianism as a moral philosophy can be summarized as a philosophy of an ideal being, and what links all his teachings is zhong, literally translated as loyalty, and the other one called shu, translated as empathy. In the Doctrine of the Mean, another important Confucian text, it is said, before the feelings of pleasure, anger, sorrow, and joy are aroused, it is called equilibrium. When these feelings are aroused, and each and all attain due measure and degree, it is called harmony. The text describes a noble person, as someone who is watchful over herself even when she is alone. She does not allow herself to indulge in degenerate or improper thinking. The reason is that what one harbors in one's mind will inevitably be manifested in one's appearance, in one's conduct. Confucius recommends that people should constantly examine themselves to see whether they have been honest with each other, whether they have been conscientious in their tasks, whether they have put into practice what they have learned from their teachers. The goal of Confucians is to develop ourselves into becoming a paragon of self, and to help develop others into becoming better human beings. Thus, to be a Confucian is to never allow a momentary lapse in the task of self-improvement, and ultimately carry oneself throughout one's entire life. Confucius remarks this as, "Does even a noble person encounter hardship? Of course, a noble person encounters hardship. The difference is that the petty person encountering hardship is overwhelmed by it.